This is Space Minds from SpaceNews. In this episode of Space Minds, Mike Gruss sits down with a panel of experts at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg Center to discuss the future of the U.S. Space Force. He's joined by Susanne Hake from Vantor, John Plumb from K2 Space, and Dennis Woodfork from the Johns Hopkins University. As part of an event at the center's Discovery Series, they explored the problems congestion on orbit creates, where the Space Force needs to focus next, and possible application for AI.
Thank you, Sibel, and thank you, Paige, and thanks to all of you. Welcome. I'm excited for the discussion this evening, and we have a great panel to talk about the Space Force. I'd like to introduce them just briefly. Dennis Woodfork, a missionary executive for National Security Space at APL, Susanne Hake, executive vice president of Vantor, and John Plumb, head of strategy at K2 Space. I think one way to understand the Space Force, or maybe the need for a separate service, is this idea of the 3 Cs that we just heard Sibel mentioned. That space is contested, congested, and competitive. Contested, generally, we're talking about China and Russia and the development of weapons that could be used in space. This morning, the Atlantic Council released a report about Russia's likelihood of using a weapon in space. Congested, there are a few recent examples here, including the Spanish satellite, the Chinese space station vehicle, that both appear to have been hit by debris. Competitive, we see nations and increasingly industry vying for dominance. So let's start and talk about which of these worries you the most, and what's the solution, or more appropriately, a realistic path to a solution. Dennis, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks again for having me, and thanks to SpaceNews and Johns Hopkins University for putting on this event. So, I think the contested nature of space does give us pause. At APL, we're worried about that every day, and trying to establish ways, technologies, partnerships. How do we accelerate industry's ability to help with the Space Force's mission of space superiority? And so the contested nature of space is accelerating, right? And so you don't not only have China is putting up their own P-LEO constellation because they want to make sure that they have that advantage. But as we extend out and we get to 2040, right, the contested nature of the cislunar regime, I think, demands new technologies, new ways of thinking, we'll talk about deterrence. I think that's what worries me the most. And how we get, the solution is probably looking at our ability to operationalize that domain faster and establish these norms so that we can have the ecosystem that is advantageous to us and deterring our adversaries.
Susanne.
Good. Well, thank you so much for having me as well. And to keep it interesting, I'm not going to pick the same one, which leaves you in a tough spot. But I'm going to go with congested. I think, congested really has the potential to turn, competition into conflict. And you can think about, everything that's going on in space right now. There's VCs are investing a ton of money into the defense tech community and space in particular. With the cost of launch going down, right, we have so many more companies launching things, and there's more satellites, there's more proximity operations, there's just so much more going on. And as there's more, satellites in space, that's when miscalculations can happen, and they can be interpreted or misinterpreted as potentially hostile activity. And so when I think about sort of the challenge of congested space, it's really about how do we bring that awareness to what's in space and what are those other things, how are we characterizing them and understanding them? And I think that's where some of the potential threat can happen, when there's really a misunderstanding or lack of understanding of what's around you.
Do you see that in day-to-day operations now? Is that congestion, or how is that congestion affecting your day-to-day operations today?
Yeah, I mean, so for Vantor, we're a company that operates satellites. We have 10 EO satellites in space. And, for us, we put a lot of work into understanding what's around us, being able to maneuver from other satellites or debris. And then as a company, we also develop capabilities for Space Force and many other customers for them to understand space situational awareness too.
Great. John.
All right, well, I'm not going to choose competitive. So. Look, I actually think it's interesting first of all, everyone has their own C's. I'll get to mine at some point today. But the contested part.
Don't tease us. Tell us.
I had, when I was ASD, I had the space classification, space control, space cooperation, and commercial space. So I started with 3, I ended up at 4. It's fine. But these are traditional. It's good. Here's what I would say. The contested part is the thing that I think most national security minds think about. But one of the reasons it's so challenging is because of the growing congestion, right? So in a very sparsely occupied space, a contested environment where China uses a ASAT against one satellite would only have effect on that one satellite. But right now, we saw even that one test they did a few years ago, it has effects that go through all countries, all orbits, challenges human space flight. And so there's this question, there's this balance of the contested environment and how do you operate in that as a military when the after effects are so much different than they are in any other domain. And so I think that's the thing that's really keen. And I will just say on one of the problems on the contested side, coming from a startup satellite company here, K2 Space now, is the understanding that we need to move faster with commercial is there. I feel like that is a well understood problem set. How to actually do it and how to get rid of all these legacy big R requirements, little r requirements, and non-requirements that are just hurdles is a heck of a challenge.
I'm curious more about your other 3 C's. Why did you develop that, or what's wrong, or what has evolved from those original 3 C's?
So I would say that okay. So the way to think about national security space is to think about space as a domain that is a little bit different because your satellite just doesn't operate over your territory, right? Once you're in space, you're going over the entire planet, right? All other satellites are going over the entire planet. And so you have this issue with the congested piece is really a problem, okay. But how do you operate from a national security standpoint? The biggest challenge to everyone in this room that wants to do national security, whether they're from the United States or from an allied country, is our classification barriers are miserable. They're miserable to even cooperate within the Space Force. They're harder to cooperate with the Space Force and with other surfaces. They're hard to cooperate between different forms of warfighters, and they're almost impossible to cooperate between new entrants to industry or with allies and partners. And it really limits the U.S. and allied ability to move faster on national security at a time when China just keeps rising in prominence. And how do we counter that collectively? And it requires knocking down these classification barriers. And it's really, really hard. And the reason you know it's hard is that you can have secretaries of defense, you can have deputy secretaries, you can have DNIs all say, go fix this thing, and it doesn't get fixed. It's like this, the frozen middle doesn't begin to describe how hard this problem is.
Dennis, do you have anything you want to add there? Because I saw you nodding your
Well, no, well said. Obviously, he the years he spent trying to change that, are laudable, and I know still there's more work to be done there. I was going to take a crack at the competitive nature, and I think from a competition standpoint, we talk about it as a challenge, but I think for this country, the competition is actually our asymmetric strength against adversaries like China, right? So we want space to be competitive in a way because you want these companies to be innovating and unleashing that innovation for the benefit of this country, for space superiority and economic vitality, right? And so that's the other C for you.
Good, thank you. For completionists. I wanted to ask about the single biggest change in the space operating environment that the Space Force is maybe not prepared for yet. I mean, we talk about classification not changing. What is something that is maybe either changing faster than expected or that the Space Force needs to think harder about? Susanne, I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, I think, I was having a hard time coming up with a single thing, to be honest, but I was really thinking about just how the overall operating environment is changing so quickly and the need for kind of an increased understanding at speed, right? The operational environment is changing rapidly, and decisions now need to be made within, seconds. And so really thinking about for everything that's going on in space, how do we move data quickly? How do we move processing into space or faster into the ground? And how do we really think about that decision speed timeline? Because once something happens in space, there's seconds, to understand what's happening, make a characterization, a decision, and potentially take an action.
And help me out, how's that different from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
I think because you're also adding in the complexity of the congestion that we've talked about, that you need to be able to make a decision even faster because the impacts of the decision you made can have even further impact on everything, right? There's so much of our daily lives revolve in things going on in space, right? GPS satellites, stoplights, banks, ATMs, all those things are reliant on different space-based activities. And so any kind of maneuver or action in space can have a really large impact. So I think it's that combination of the congestion and that need for speed that changes things.
That's good. John?
Sure, actually, it's an excellent point. I was just going to think, 20 years ago, very different than what it looks like now. A few satellites in GEO, a couple of things here in LEO, whatever. But now, LEO's getting incredibly complicated, I think would be a fair way to say it. And the ability to conduct effects in space is becoming more democratized among nation states. So I think it's really challenging. When you say what's the one thing, my mind...
Or a one thing.
Yeah, a one thing. There is no one thing. The thing we're definitely not prepared for is a nuclear weapon going off in space. 100%. We are not prepared for that. No one is. I think in some weird way, the fact that China has built such an arsenal of satellites, or fleet of satellites, if you prefer to think in a more forgiving term, provides one of the best deterrents to that type of use, because now it wouldn't benefit it would damage more than just one side of whatever kind of Cold War we might be in right now. But we are not ready for that type of thing. And that's really dangerous because a nuclear weapon is available to more states than just China or just Russia. And so that's a really dangerous place to be.
This was an idea that was talked about, or I guess more than an idea, but this was talked about a lot 2 summers ago because there was talk that Russia was developing this. But what has changed since then or what have you seen that made you think, hey, the Space Force is maybe a little more prepared for this, or is thinking about this in a different way?
Is more prepared for it? They're certainly thinking about it and treating it seriously, and this is an unclassified conversation, but you asked the question, what are we not prepared for? We are not prepared for that as a society, let alone as a Space Force.
Dennis?
Yeah, so that would have been my answer too. So I'll go to, I think we're, the future operating environment of humans, transiting back and forth to the moon is the thing that I'm not sure, right? Well, I know there are things that we're going to find out, technologies that need to be invented. And so, the Artemis 2 is going to happen hopefully next month, knock on wood. And that's the next era, right? The first, new space age era was 2007 with the ASAT test that China did, and that got us into this whole space is not benign, it's a warfighting domain. I think the next era is, okay, we've got humans transiting back and forth, and there's infrastructure needs, there are security, economic needs and security needs that the Space Force is going to be absolutely a part of that, right? And making sure that ecosystem is secure, much like the Navy does for our seas. And so I think that's the thing that they need to be ready for in this coming decade.
Are you seeing signs that that's being talked about or discussed in a way you're feeling more comfortable about?
Yes. So Lieutenant General retired John Shaw, I think, coined the term dynamic space operations. I think his thought leadership has started a lot of people thinking about that, right? And what does that actually mean? It means that you're not thinking about launching a satellite to a position and holding that position forever, right? Like we do in GEO. You're really now thinking about how do you maneuver in a domain where you have to have logistics, you have to worry about command and control, long distances for long distances for communication and protection. All of those things you have to now think about, PNT, those kinds of things. So I think when he started those conversations and people are starting to write papers, I think now we're starting to think about that. And APL's been doing the Cislunar Security Conference for the last few years where we talk about this. So I do have hope that we're going to get there.
Yeah. And quick plug for SpaceNews. I know there's a story this month about 2026 will be the year of more dynamic space operations. Let's do a quick lightning round here. John, we'll start with you. What is one emerging space technology? Just one. What's one? It doesn't have to be the one. What is one emerging space technology do you think is most underappreciated?
I personally think the emergence of high bandwidth direct to cell phone SATCOM is underappreciated. It is coming. It's actually coming faster than anyone appreciates, even when you take that sentence into account. And so I think that is going to change all sorts of national security problem sets if any cell phone has kind of reliable SATCOM. That is a very new problem set, and I think it makes space superiority very difficult.
Dennis.
I think the ability to communicate between constellations, between networks, is an underappreciated technology. APL just helped launch the polylingual experiment technology, where it's a software-defined radio that can connect between LEO, MEO, GEO, the ground, but also hop between networks that commercial, government. I think that's underappreciated because in the future, right, we talk about space superiority, it's about being able to connect and close those kill chains. And so I think that's something that we need to watch, is the ability to make sure that our packets get from A to B and they're assured and we know that they're ours, and that we can use those in ways to our advantage.
Great. Suzanne.
Yeah, have we been up here for 20 minutes and no one said AI yet? Okay, just checking. I won't use that for my answer, though.
I've got an AI question coming. Don't worry.
Okay, just checking, because that felt like a necessary response. So a slightly different take. I think one of the things that's really top of mind is cyber resilience. So, the space systems are more software connected and software defined. Being able to protect them from cyber attacks is going to be really important. And that's thinking about, detecting anomalies and maintaining control of your satellite during a cyber attack, and even be able to continue your mission. So I think the kind of cyber resilience and those related capabilities are increasingly important.
If I could just jump in there, I think that's a great point, Suzanne, and I think one of the issues about trying to integrate commercial solutions better into the Space Force or better in the military services is this issue of cyber hardening. And are they going to be available in an actual conflict, or are they already compromised? Now, you could also argue that for, military systems bought through legacy acquisition channels, but this is a real concern because that changes kind of the warfare piece. And I think making sure that we both have real deep understanding of how to defend in depth, and also, on the offensive side as well from cyber, is a very important part of warfare now.
All right, one more quick lightning round question here, which is one threat to the space environment that you think deserves more attention. Suzanne. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. So I touched on this actually a little bit in my opening comment about the congestion, but I really think kind of this concept of ambiguity in space, and how the ambiguity of understanding who's around you, what their characteristics are, and what their capabilities are is just going to create a lot of potential threats.
Okay. John?
So what's a threat? Say that again?
Yeah, one threat to the space environment that you think deserves more attention.
Outside of the nuclear piece.
That can be a good answer.
No, that's all right. Look, I think it is a many-fold problem. And so if you're looking for specific technology, I start to get uncomfortable talking from a classification standpoint. But I would just say the ambiguity piece could be built into this, frankly, Suzanne said. But the idea of threats from anywhere is an interesting problem set, and I think,
as opposed to just a few.
Just a few, a couple known sites with a order of battle of a couple missiles. That's a thing of the past. These are gone, and so one of the solutions that the department's pursuing, of course, is how do you proliferate across different orbits to try to minimize the value of an attack from any one type of threat, and ideally figure out a way that you can operate through those types of attacks to kind of continue to deter that type of conflict in space at least below the level of a World War III. You're trying to keep the pressure down so that these attacks do not add value and instead are negative. And so how do you do this? It's a really hard problem, and it continues to grow as there's more and more satellites. And that, to say nothing of what's the difference between a national satellite and a satellite operated by Vantor or by K2 Space, right? Is that an American satellite? What is that? There's a lot of emerging, I think ambiguity is a perfect word, but confusion is another one.
Yeah, and that feels like that's blurred more in the last couple of years. Yeah. Dennis.
I think they covered. I mean, I do think it's the ambiguity of more actors, more folks in space with their own missions, their own objectives, and how do you tell friendly from foe? Who's what is that satellite actually doing? Is it what it said it actually is? Right, those types of things I think is a threat. But yeah, I would say the ability to shape the perception of folks is going to be a threat, right? The digital nature of space means that if you can make things appear, differently, then I think you can cause unintended consequences, right? And I think that's a threat. We're going to need to make sure when we see things, we know how do we verify what that thing is, and then move on to the next thing, right?
And do it quickly. Yeah.
Right?
All right, let's talk a little bit about space deterrence, because I think that's a topic that comes up a lot, and I think it's also one, to me, that sometimes can feel very abstract, and it's hard to make sense of. So what does space deterrence look like in 5 years, and how is that even different from 5 years ago from today? And I'll open it up to the panel, whoever wants to start.
Yeah, I can start. So, I mean, in terms of how things have changed, right, now, because of all the capabilities that we have in space, we are able to see and understand a lot more of what's out there, right? And, I think to your specific question in terms of how do you think about space deterrence, maybe an analogous thing to think about is sort of like a neighborhood watch concept, right? Where, I don't have any data in front of me, but I assume that there's data that says that, neighborhoods that have signs that there's a neighborhood watch or talk about a neighborhood watch have less crime, right? And so maybe there's a kind of parallel to what's going on in space of, when there's an awareness of what's around you, there's known capabilities to take images and characterize things that in and of itself can provide some amount of deterrence.
Yeah, I'll just take this in a slightly different direction and say I don't think deterrence in space is the right framework. I think it's deterrence. How do you deter conflict? But what you're really saying is we now understand collectively that space is a warfighting domain, and things that Dennis and I have worked on is how do we normalize that as a warfighting domain. But that means it's just one more place where militaries operate, where they try to deter conflict across the entire spectrum. So I think the concern folks have is that in an actual conflict situation, premeditated by design, it may kick off in space, kick off in the cyber domain and space domain, because it feels to the humans on the ground like that may be a little bit less impactful, but it has a huge impacts on the downstream fight. But I think really it's not deterring in space, it's deterrence. So you have to have credible deterrence across, terrestrial, air, undersea, and space, and be able to operate credibly there. And that's a difficult thing. It really has a whole nother dimension.
Yeah, I would say 1,000% agree with both colleagues. Strategic deterrence, I think, for us is going to look like establishing norms of behavior and infrastructure that I think deters bad actors from doing something different. An example is we've got norms of behavior for the sea and air, and if you see someone doing something unsafe, right, people can point that out and say that's bad, right? That can be a form of deterrence, and I think for us, the cislunar, the domain of space, we're going to have the same thing. Establishing infrastructure and norms will help us deter adversaries. Operationally, I think you look at what General Whiting, the commander of U.S. Space Command, has done, and he's doing a fantastic job of getting forces ready for conflict, right, for crisis and conflict, and doing that in a way that you can deter our adversaries because they can see, oh, they've got it together. They're actually, not only are they operating and showing proficiency, but now they're partnering with multinational, right, partners in commercial, and now they're showing this locking network of space power, right? And I think that is operationally an absolute deterrent that needs to continue, right? We need to, I think, accelerate and expand our ability to deter bad behavior, like you said, through all domains. Space is just one lever.
I think this year in particular, since the beginning of 2025, we're still a new year, we've certainly heard more about space capabilities being used more for narcotics, drug interdiction. We've heard that from the White House. We've heard from the DNI saying it's a priority. We've heard about it from some of the space intelligence agencies. I think that's a good example, but looking ahead, describe what the role of the Space Force looks like in 2040 and how that's different from the work that's being done today. I'll tell you, we had a couple audience suggestions here where people asked about, the inevitable scramble for lunar resources, such as helium-3. That someone asked, will there be a future military astronaut corps in 2040 that is different from today? So lots of ideas there, but Dennis, do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's fun to envision this future, and I've used this analogy before. I think right now, right, the Space Force is like a littoral service, right? If you think about the analogy of the seas, right, you've got a brown water navy, and then you've got the blue water navy, and those domains are different, right? You think about things differently when you can get out of your boat and touch land versus when you're out in the middle of the Pacific and you don't have the infrastructure and support, right? And I think so. If you think about the Space Force right now, we are terrestrially tied, absolutely, right? We're there to establish space superiority in support of the national command authorities and what their military and national objectives are. But as you look out, right, that changes. The ecosystem of cislunar means you need a blue water Navy type Space Force. It needs to be able to go out, it needs to be able to sustain itself, and it needs to be able to operate in that domain and establish space superiority at the time and place of its choosing, just like we do in the other domains, right? So that means it's going to need logistics thought about in different ways, communication, autonomy, AI. All of that is different, and it will be different, I think, in the 2040 time.
How's that conversation evolving right now? Like, where do you, because I think that's a fairly new, at least I'm hearing it more frequently now than I was a couple years ago, but that, hey, it's not just this little bit of space. It's much broader that we have to think about.
I think folks are starting to think about that. I think, NASA has commissioned IM Intuitive Machines, right, for that cislunar infrastructure. APL's absolutely a part of that. And I think as people start to think about what does it take to sustain human presence on the moon, all of those conversations start to expand to, well, if you need that infrastructure, then you probably need that security. You'll need that autonomy so you can make decisions faster. And so I think in the corners of people, like commercial companies, as well as labs and industry, I think we are now starting to have those conversations.
Susanne.
Yeah, I mean, you started your question asking about or kind of alluding to the use of space in, Venezuela and some recent drug interdictions and things like that. And I won't comment on, particular companies and whether or not particular capabilities were used there. But I do think that's a preview in terms of where we will see space-based capabilities used in the future, right? Moving beyond typical like military operations into more disaster relief, into infrastructure and supply chain and all these different use cases. So as space is used for so many of these different kind of capabilities in the future, that's going to require Space Force to kind of evolve how they're thinking about these things.
And what does that look like, or where does that thinking go? Like, how is that different from today, and where does it go?
Yeah, I mean, I think it, requires more integration of capabilities. We've talked about, John talked about deterrence across all of the domains. In order to fully incorporate space, we need that integration of space fully into air, land, and space. So I think that's going to be one of the key pieces as space is used for, more use cases, that we have to see that technical integration, that agency, those policy integrations, like all of those coming together.
Great. John.
Yeah, sure. So I think it's tough to look out 15 years, right? 5 is easier. I I think it's hard to say what would the different applications be. I think what is clear is the path that we should be on and people want to be on is integrating Space Force as a military service and a provider of force effects deeper and deeper into the warfight, right? And so most of my career, space has been this thing on the other side of a wall, right? You have an exercise, things are happening, and then a little card comes over like, oh, this just happened. Like, how did that, here's a card. No, it didn't, right? So it's a very confusing way to run exercises, but I think as we integrate space more and more, and that's the thing that I think is strange, because if you think about the challenge of fighting in space and our overdependence in space on the nation, which is sort of an Achilles heel, but also our strength, one direction would be to get away from being connected to space. I just don't see it. I don't think it's happening. I think it's going to be more and more connected, and as we throw thousands and thousands more satellites up, the connectivity is going to increase in a way that is almost counterintuitive. And I think a really lean, mean fighting machine of a Space Force in 2040 is going to have to account for this massive amount, really, of metal in space doing all of these services, and how do you use that to the advantage of the joint force? It's I think it looks like baby steps now. I think 15 years puts us on the right path.
All right, here's the AI question, and we'll keep this. We'll keep this.
Do you have a quantum? Do you have a quantum question too?
No quantum. Then we'll save that for the next one. What's one surprising role AI will play in space operations? And we'll keep this as a lightning round. But Suzanne, you can start since I know you're excited.
I set myself up for that, huh? So, I think, and this is like kind of especially with the Vantor perspective, is using AI to really, look at imagery, right? There's so many images that are taken of Earth or of space right now, and being able to use AI, run algorithms, identify and characterize what's in those images.
And again, that's faster than we've ever been able to do that.
Yeah, faster than we've been able to do it before, and more accurate as well.
Okay, John.
Yeah, so going farther on that, I would just say tremendous amount of satellites in space doing imagery, doing different types of sensing, and tons of data. How do you process that data? Right now, the way a lot of the data is processed, it all gets piped back down to Earth and is processed on Earth. So I think the natural evolution here is true edge processing, where a satellite itself or a small group of satellites communicating can solve what is needed on the ground by the human operator, filter out the rest to reduce how much flow, how much data flow has to get to a warfighter, get to a center. And I think that's a really interesting thing that just it's tantalizingly close to a thing that we should be getting after.
And we're starting to see some companies really look at that, I think.
That's right.
Dennis.
Yeah, it's actually, I think, a two-sided coin with AI for me. So I think AI is going to, if we project out to 2040, I think AI is going to be key in saving a life. I think as we have humans and astronauts and things like that, you're making decisions, medical decisions, whatever it is, AI will be potentially the thing that actually we're leaning on to, make recommendations on how to save someone that is out there so far that they can't get back fast. On the other side of that coin is I think AI is going to enable us to close kill chains, so destroy things faster than ever, right? AI is about decision superiority, right? And so making decisions in that OODA loop faster than your enemy is what I think is key. So both destroy and save, I think AI has that promise of.
I was just going to add one thing, I think, to build on that as well. It's really, who can use AI the best? Who knows when to use AI? Who knows when not to? When you think about, in particular, using AI in more of a, like military or kinetic or kind of war context, there's real decisions to be made that are not just looking at AI and making a decision, right? There's strategic, there's moral, there's all these aspects to it. And so when you think about the use of AI, it's not only like who has the best models, but it's also when do I apply it and when don't I apply it, right?
Right, yeah, absolutely.
That's a good question, when not to use AI.
Yeah. On your homework. That's
yeah. Thanks, sir. Let's talk a little bit about culture and talent, because I think that's something that comes up a lot when we're chatting about the Space Force, and the Space Force being a new service. I think they still have that opportunity to shape their culture and talent. And so how does that culture need to evolve to retain the talent required for this very fast-moving environment we've just spent the last 35 minutes talking about in this very highly technical domain. And Dennis, I know this is something you're passionate about, so let's start there.
Absolutely. Thank you. So I don't think there's anything like I would say it needs to evolve because there's something lacking. I think the Space Force has done an absolute fantastic job creating war fighters that have a technical mindset. Like how does my technical job support the joint fight? And I think they've done a fantastic job of building that warfighter culture. What we want to see more of is this permeable membrane where the Guardians are actually interacting with industry and understanding how their technologies can enable, right, their mission set. There's that space superiority. JHU is the PME, the Professional Military Education for the Space Force, and we treasure that at APL because we're part of that, where we can bring Guardians, right, that are getting their education to APL, and they can learn about some of the technologies. How do we do kill chain engineering? How do we do, communications PNT? All of that is, I think, helping build this culture of a technically oriented warfighter that really can outthink and out-innovate our adversaries. So I think it's really important that they continue that.
John?
Yeah, Dennis, I think you're exactly right. And I was a submarine officer, right? So the Navy is also, I wish the Space Force had taken the Navy ranks, whatever. But the reason I bring up the submarine piece is I was a nuclear engineer, and a warfighter. And I think this is the culture that the Space Force needs to push. And this is, I would disagree to say we're right there. I mean, I think this is a generational problem. This is going to take 15 years to push this kind of culture through, and you're going to need to find a way to have continuity across different chiefs of service, different secretaries of the Air Force. But I think engineers first, that can understand satellite mechanics and operations, and as well as SATCOM and moving data around, and then the idea of like acquisition and operation. I think I'm personally not convinced that those should be two separate paths. I don't understand why they are not more intertwined, and I think that would make the Space Force stronger. I think it would make the conversations back with industry stronger, and I think it would naturally drive the cadre of Space Force professionals to be more and more engineering inclined to be able to survive that academic level. So I think that is the place to go. It's probably the most acquisition heavy of any service, and in a way where it's absolutely important, and it actually moves at a faster clip than acquisition in other services, which is a shocking thing to say. So to me, there is a future there, but it's really difficult, as with anything with the military or as with anything in the Pentagon, really difficult to kind of keep the movie going year after year with changes in leadership, and not even just political, just changes in leadership, and so people want to put their new things. So I think some vision of where that should go would be really helpful.
I think from a kind of talent and recruiting perspective, right? We live in a world where the best engineers are paid like pro football salaries to go to some of the top companies in the military, and many of us just simply cannot compete with that. But I think from a talent perspective, leaning more into kind of the mission side to hire those engineers, that's something that Space Force and any of the military can provide that almost no company can, right? Proximity to the mission and impact. So I think when you're competing for talent, and money isn't going to be the way that you're bringing talent in, kind of leaning into some of those other aspects.
We have about 2 minutes left, and we did time this pretty well. I have one more question here. But it's the space policy question, which means we have to leave some time for John here. But what's one policy decision that could be settled in, let's say, the next 3 years that would set the Space Force up for success in 2040, which is what we're talking about tonight? So
Do you want him
no,
to-
let's let him
Great.
let's
Okay.
let him close.
Okay. All right, TikTok, Dennis.
Clock's
All right,
ticking.
okay,
All right, Dennis,
awesome.
go ahead.
Yeah, so really quickly, I think our ability, and it's kind of probably what branching off of what he's going to say, is our ability to partner with our allies in a way that allows us to really be lethal in what we're doing for space warfighting. I think being able to share data is one thing, but being able to be interoperable in our technologies and what we're doing on orbit and on the ground is something that we need to accelerate our ability to integrate with our allies so that we can show that united front to our adversaries.
Yeah, actually, I had a similar thought. It's really about kind of that interoperability, whether it's with other countries and allied nations or setting kind of technology interoperability and integration. If we don't have that, we're not going to be able to bring in new technology and capabilities. So, yeah, I think it's really about that. And we've left you a little bit of time.
Great, 48 seconds.
Take us home.
So, look, I'm going to end where we started, at least my opening comment, which is I think the fundamental hurdle to moving faster, doing interoperability with allies or even across different services is the overclassification problem. Space remains overclassified. Senior level leadership pushes down to try to get that solved, and it still is not moving fast enough. It takes too long to get your clearances on the industry side. It takes too long to get a skiff set up, and that isn't even getting to the point of why are these things still so classified that it's hard to move the data around. And I think 3 years is the perfect time frame. That would bring right to the end of this administration. I really think they could solve this problem.
Great. Thank you. Let's have a big round of applause for our panel.